Before I get started, we've all been sitting for a little while, so we're going to actually do something as a group that is going to kick off my presentation. Okay, so if you were born before 1968, let me make sure I got that right, before 1968, stand up. Okay, don't anybody take notes in terms of who's older or younger. And among the people who are standing, if you drive differently now than you did before 10 years ago, 15 years ago, raise your hand if your driving has changed. Okay, just curious, in terms of people who have their hands up, would anybody like to share how your driving's changed?
I speed less.
You speed less. What else? What in the back of the room?
No motorcycles.
No motorcycles, okay. What else? Yes.
I'm more cautious before I turn.
You're more cautious before making a turn. Yes, ma'am.
I drive less.
You drive less. Ding, ding, ding.
One over here.
Sir?
No night driving.
No night driving. Perfect. So, welcome to the world of being an older driver. And part of the reason, and hopefully everyone's a little more awake now. And part of the reason that I wanted to kick this off is, doing that is, I think we tend to think about older adults and their mobility as if there's somebody outside of ourselves. There's some other person. And I know for me, I also don't drive at night the way I used to. And I live in New Jersey, and the Garden State Parkway seems to have gotten much darker in the last 5 years. I used to routinely go up and down the parkway for a job. And in the last few years, I've noticed it just seems darker.
And oncoming lights is a lot better.
Right, they changed the light, right. It's like my clothes getting bigger and smaller because of the laundry. It's the same story. But, so I wanted to sort of kick us off that way because I think it helps us put our conversation in a context of, this is us. This is not somebody outside of ourselves. And so when we're thinking about strategies and possibilities, to be thinking inclusively even in our own conversations. So what's aging in place? Aging in place is really this idea of people being able to live independently in their community as long as possible. And the community needs the community adapting to their needs so they can stay in place, and that there's this evolutionary process. If we think back to the beginning of the baby boom, when boomers first started being born and then going to school and then needing parks, we built systems and schools and playgrounds and ball fields to accommodate them. And then we built college classrooms. And then we built single-family homes because there was a need for the community to adapt to the population. And so when we talk about aging in place, we're talking about that kind of adaptation and awareness of this evolution. So we're not the only place in the world that's experiencing this issue of aging. We heard a little bit earlier about Japan. I'd also bring to mind Korea in terms of a country that's got a significant aging population. The World Health Organization has looked at this problem, opportunity, challenge from a global perspective. And through that global lens, we see a variety of topic areas that really connect up with this question of what makes something age-friendly. And you can see transportation is right there. But there's also these other aspects that we've been hearing about today. Certainly, social participation is a piece that we've been hearing about, and civic participation is a piece that we've been hearing about. And all of these pieces come together when we begin to think about older adults, their mobility, and how they can age successfully. A number of major cities in the world have signed on to this age-friendly city initiative, New York being one of them. In my home state of New Jersey, so has Princeton and Montclair, but so have cities like Seoul and Dijon and Istanbul, because this is really much bigger than just us. One of the features that really defines where we are demographically as a country and as a world is that we've had an unprecedented increase in longevity just in the last 100 years. And we talk about this aging population, but I think when you take a step back and you look at longevity has increased by 30 years, basically in the last 110 years. That change is unprecedented in human history. And we're really not prepared for it. We don't really know what to do with those extra 30 years. Our systems haven't adapted to that. In 1950, just over 8% of the US population was over age 65, and that was 12 million people. By 2030, it'll be over 20%, but it's gonna be 72, almost 73 million people. That's a dramatic and unprecedented shift, and something that we've got to figure out what to do with that. But one of the things I would like to sort of get you to begin thinking about is where there's challenge, there's also opportunity. And this 30 years represents a possibility for our world and for our society. And we don't generally think about it that way. So I'm going to just plant that seed and I'll come back to it. So this presentation I'm doing today is adapted from something that I initially did in Trenton to our new administration as part of a briefing series from the Voorhees Center and the Blaustein School. So forgive me for the New Jersey demographics, but these projections of growth in terms of the older population in New Jersey are similar to the population in your state. This is not, we're not unusual. We're not Florida, we're not Arizona in that sense. But you can see that between 2015 and 2034, period of 19 years, in New Jersey, our over 60 population is going to increase to almost 2.5 million people. That's inside of a population of 9.7 million projected. In New Jersey, the Department for the Aging uses 60 as its cutoff, so I'm using that number. The 75 plus population is going to increase as well, incredibly dramatically, by 61%. And at the same time, our under 60 population is only going to increase by 2%. So that's a huge shift as well in terms of who's going to be living in New Jersey and what are their needs and what can we expect. We've heard some of this referred to in other presentations today, and forgive me in advance if I sound like a broken record, but some of these things are so significant, and particularly for my colleagues here who are engineers and don't come from the world of aging. Okay, so you're going to hear it 3 or 4 times today. We've been hearing it 300, 400 times over the last few years. But this issue of age-related changes means changes in vision, changes in hearing, decreased physical fitness and flexibility. I don't know about you guys, I just got my first car that's got a backup camera, and my neck is so happy, right? Because I'm not doing this anymore. Those changes are normative. That happens as we age. That's not something that all of a sudden you wake up, when you're 85 years old and these changes happen. They begin in your 40s and 50s, and they're progressive as we grow older. The reduced ability to focus, increased reaction time, that beat it takes to respond to something, it just gets a little longer, and that's normal. One of the other things that is normative with aging and that we can expect is losses. And we heard a little bit today about losing a spouse and losing friends. But as we make these transitions to older age, we also generally stop working, or our work may change, and there's an identity that's connected with employment that may shift. Sometimes there's a relocation, so you may not be aging in the community that you initially envisioned, that you've been in for 30 or 40 years. You may be moving somewhere else. So there's social connections that change. So the physical connections are happening in conjunction with all of these other changes in terms of a whole cascade of experiences. So these losses, these physical changes, the social isolation that can happen when you're no longer living with a spouse, all of these things have impacts on mobility, and you've heard some of these numbers earlier today in terms of non-drivers and people who are dependent on others. One of the statistics I find particularly interesting is that 21% of people over the age of 65 do not drive. That number's been holding relatively constant, but remember, that's going to increase to almost 73 million people that 21% is going to be put against. And that is really a big part of this challenge in terms of the impacts on mobility. And we know that when people stop driving, there is this correlation between losing independence and increasing social isolation. So you've also heard a wonderful presentation today on loneliness and the impacts of loneliness. There's also been some research recently on how social isolation and health play out against each other. And this particular piece of research that came out of Stanford's Demographic Center looked at high level of social isolation related to Medicare costs. And their findings from November of 2017, which were also supported by the AARP Policy Institute, showed that there's a connection. I want to be careful because I'm with real researchers. They've observed a relationship between people who score high on this social isolation tool incur more Medicare costs. And that when you take that Medicare cost per person and you roll it out across the entire US population, you get to $6.7 billion of more money spent on Medicare around these folks who are more socially isolated. We also know that having a greater number of social connections is associated with a reduced risk of premature death. And as we heard today, loneliness is highest in people over age 80. We heard over 90 in terms of the specific numbers. But all of these pieces play together because we know when people are connected and they're active and they're engaged with others and they're cognitively aware and their emotional well-being is better, they have better outcomes and they're able to stay in the community and remain independent. So let's talk about the nuts and bolts of connectivity, like why bother, right? What's the flip side? What's the good news? 80% of people over the age of 65 donated to charity in 2015, and their average donation was almost $1,700. Now, again, I'm not a researcher, I'm a practitioner, but I think it's awfully interesting that the Medicare number and the philanthropy number almost balance each other. If you wanted to look at what's the downside and what's the upside, isolation versus connectivity, through a social lens, here's two interesting things to put against one another. In terms of civic engagement, people over the age of 50 volunteer an average of 133 hours a year. And in the most recent presidential election, which had, I think, the lowest turnout in history, if I'm not mistaken, almost 71% of citizens over the age of 65 reported voting. So if anybody needs to go home and to a politician why this is important, there's your statistic. So expanding mobility matters because mobility is really the glue between what people want and how they get it satisfied, right? It's the connection. And in the work that we do at NJTIP at Rutgers, where we train people to use public transportation, one of the things we try to do is to get them to think about their mobility first through the lens of what can I get to on my own steam? What's readily accessible to me? What can I walk to? What can I ride a bike to? And that may seem very basic, but we are in a culture that says, I need to go to that grocery store that's 30 miles away. Maybe there's some place you can get bread and milk that's not 30 miles away. And to get older adults to start to think about what can I get to under my own steam creates more of a sense of empowerment and independence as opposed to waiting for that ride. If you can walk somewhere, can it connect you to public transit? And where does that go? It may not go to the Kings in Madison where your daughter would take you on Sunday to go grocery shopping, but it may take you along a corridor where there's things that could be interesting or useful to you, and provide social connection, and provide some mobility in terms of getting out into the community, which in and of itself may have a benefit. Of course, if you have access to a private vehicle, either as a passenger or as a driver, your range of mobility is going to get even bigger. But by thinking about those spheres, we begin to help people think about the opportunities and the assets that are in their community, rather than being very fixated on a specific destination as the only place that could potentially be of interest to them. So, we think about transportation like the guy on the left. How am I going to get from point A to point B? How do I get to the Kings in Madison? As opposed to really, we heard about mobility management just a few minutes ago from Virginia, thinking about the person in the middle and all the places they might go, and how might they get there. And rather than being tied to only one mode, thinking about a variety of options that can connect the person with the things they need or want to do. And so that's our second guy, that sort of connected guy, who's in the middle of where he would like to go, and has a variety of options available to him. When you have more choices, you have more independence. And there's lots of modes that are available to older adults. We tend to work traditionally with public transportation, but increasingly in my program, we're also looking at Uber and Lyft as ways we can help people make the connections that they want to make, particularly if they're more than half a mile or a quarter mile from the bus stop or from the train. We're looking at rides with friends and family and safer driving. It's another important strategy. I live in a suburban state. Walkability, and what's the built environment look like in a community? In some of the survey work we've done at the Voorhees Transportation Center, which I'll mention a little bit later, we found that walking was the second most prevalent way that older adults who lived in northern New Jersey, 13 northern counties of New Jersey, population of 7 million, some of it's Newark, but some of it's horse country. Walking was the second most prevalent way that they took trips, because they did their short trips by foot in their area. Reliable fixed route transportation, we'll talk about that a little bit more and what that looks like. Specialized transportation, paratransit, door to door, and then mobility on demand. Uber, Lyft, GoGo Grandparent. Those models didn't exist just a few years ago, and they're a tremendous opportunity in terms of connectivity. So I mentioned some research that we've done at the Voorhees Transportation Center. Last year, I was the project manager for the Coordinated Human Service Transportation Plan for Northern New Jersey. And in that capacity, we did a survey of transportation disadvantaged populations in those 13 northern counties. 3,700 participants in the survey, in terms of respondents, and it was a select sample specifically of our targeted population, so I need to put that caveat on it. But in looking at their responses, yes, having a friend or family member give you rides was an important piece of the puzzle, but having trains or buses that went to destinations, or having trains or buses in their residence area was also very significant. I think it's really important that we don't discount public transportation as a piece of the puzzle for a lot of older adults. And we saw that in the survey data. Now granted, in New Jersey, people know that there's public transportation. Many of them come from areas where they're familiar with it. But in our survey work, this popped as something that was important to consider specifically for older adults. So when looking at that, we looked at the transit availability in New Jersey, and I would suspect in the areas where you are, unless you live in a progressive place that has passed recent tax levies to promote transit, in which case I am very jealous. But here in New Jersey, if you look at 2014, these areas that are the deepest red, and I apologize that this is a little blurry, but these deepest areas are where the greatest concentration are of older adults. And then you can see an area that looks a little shadowed, that there's hatch marks. That's where there's currently transit service in New Jersey, where you'd have access to transit. This is the change when you get to 2045, and you can see the older population has expanded far beyond where the shadowed area is. There's not transit in a lot of the areas that we're expecting to see significant change in terms of more older adults. They're going to get more diffuse and more distributed across the state. And as you can see down in these, it's funny, I know this like the back of my hand, but I realize you guys don't. Monmouth and Ocean counties are areas that have high concentrations of 55 plus communities. Ocean County in particular has the largest concentration of older adults of any county outside Florida in the United States because of the 55 plus developments. And you can see it's not got great transit down there. So this is a challenge that we're going to have to address in New Jersey in order to sort of get prepared. So, as you know, I run a program that teaches people how to use public transportation, and I'm making an argument that thinking about public transit and how it can work with older adults is an important part of a strategy for overall mobility for an aging population. Some of the benefits of providing travel training for older adults includes empowerment and independence, increased access to meaningful activities, financial opportunities. And I raise that because one of the things that surveys have shown in terms of older adults and how they decide whether or not they can stay in a community, in many cases, the opportunity to have employment is a picture of a piece of that puzzle. Not everybody retires and decides that they're going to just have this, leisure life. Increasingly, people in their 60s and 70s and older are still working, and the ability to connect to employment and economic opportunity is an important part of deciding if they can stay in a place. Chauffeur retirement. We talked about the burden that families sometimes experience in terms of making sure that older adults in their families get to the places where they need to go. If you can help that person make fewer trips needing that ride, you get that freed up chauffeur. Cost and time savings. Uber and Lyft are great, but they're not as cheap as a reduced fare ride on the bus with a 50% discount in most parts of the country. And time savings. Usually either a volunteer program or an ADA paratransit trip, or even if you're relying on friends or family, means you're on someone else's schedule, and you may have to wait for it to be convenient for them, versus being able to use a public transit schedule, know when the bus or train is expected, and get yourself to it. So you get a little bit more freedom. If you're having a good time, you can stay longer. And improve quality of life overall, just with all of this flexibility and freedom and cost savings and time savings. So we did a program over the last 3 years through NJTIP in conjunction with the TAUP Foundation that we called TIP Smart, Senior Mobility and Resource Training. And we worked with older adults in Passaic and Bergen counties. Part of that is a very urban area, part of that is a more affluent suburban area. And we worked with older adults to teach them about public transportation in their area, and then take them out on trips using public transit. Over the 3 years, we engaged 550 older adults in classroom education, and 140 went out on field trips with us. Before they went on the field trips, these were some of the things they were concerned about. Traveling in poor weather, lack of a shelter or a place to sit, difficulty getting on or off the vehicle, safe streets, crime, and about 37% had uncertainty about using public transportation in general. So these were from pre-surveys that we did before the class and the trip. After the trip, 90% said they were more confident getting around independently. 50% felt that they would be able to pursue new activities and opportunities. 94% felt the trip was valuable, and 58% were interested in additional travel training. You should know that in terms of the folks that participated in this program, those 550 people who were in the classroom, I'm gonna, give me just a moment because I don't want to misquote my own statistics, because that's embarrassing, and it's being recorded. So, in terms of those 550 older adults, 85% of them had incomes under $25,000. 79% did not have a reduced fare card. 94% were not on ADA paratransit. They had not registered for the Access Link system in New Jersey. 89% were over age 65, and 40% of them used some sort of mobility device. So we weren't cherry picking. And I wanted to sort of make that point in terms of who participated. The other thing I should say about field trips before I move on is during the 3rd year, we added a question to our survey about if people felt, how people felt about the field trip. 98% said it was easier than I thought it would be. So whatever their expectation was about what transit was going to be like, once they went on a group trip with a trainer, it ended up being not as big a deal as they thought it would be. So when we talk about senior-friendly transit, what does that mean? Transit should be good for everybody, but if we're going to make public transit good specifically for older adults, some of the features that are important are bus stops with seating and weather protection, both for hot and for cold, for wet and for dry. Easy to understand route schedules and maps. We spend a lot of time teaching people how to read schedules. And we live in a day and an age where information could be so much simpler for people to access. Outreach, training, and marketing. The point was made earlier, people don't know about service, they don't know how to use the service. Clear visual and spoken announcements. Every bus in the United States that's doing a local bus route at this point would have audible announcement and visual announcements. Those need to be clear, they need to be properly timed. I'm seeing a nod in the back of the room. Yeah, the technology has to work. Smart cards so that fares are easy to pay. In New Jersey, we currently have a cash system and you have to have exact fare. That makes it really hard for a lot of people. Friendly drivers and conductors. It's a person thing. We're moving people. So having people who are being responsive and engaged in terms of providing that service is crucial. And then real-time service information in terms of being able to get, as Virginia said, a person on the phone. If you have a problem and you're in the system, the bus didn't come, there's a delay, to be able to call travel information and get a live person. And that should really be any time the system's off and running. Not 9 to 5, not just business hours. Whenever you're on the street, there should be the availability to talk to someone. So there's also innovations that are happening now that we're beginning to embrace in NJTIP, and that are really important in terms of TNCs and programs like GoGo Grandparent and Lyft. These really are groundbreaking. I've been working in transportation and services for older adults for the better part of, 25 years at least. In the last 3 or 4 years, we've had things evolve that we could have only dreamt of when I got out of graduate school. So being able to embrace those and use those are critical in terms of helping older adults have the mobility they need to stay in their communities, continue to contribute, continue to be engaged, for us to get the benefit of that longevity that we're seeing for the first time. ARP had, and I don't mean to sound like a commercial for ARP, but I just am so enthralled with this research. ARP has identified something they call the longevity economy. It's the economic opportunity that has been created by this additional 30 years that people are now pretty much living through routinely. And they see it through the lens of older workers are expected to be 25% of the workforce by 2020. Have to help people get to work, even if they're now older people getting to work. 26% of entrepreneurs are between 55 and 64. People are starting companies at that part of their life. People over age 50 control almost 80% of the net worth in the United States. And new older adult markets like telemedicine, mobile health, regenerative medicine, these are opportunities where we could potentially see tremendous economic growth in our country, and they're specifically targeted towards this population. There's an asset piece here that if we choose to see it, we can potentially benefit from. And some of that has actually been monetized in work that's been done in Kansas City and Atlanta, looking at the economic impact of holding on to their older populations or attracting more older adults to their communities in terms of what that does to their GDP and to the number of jobs in those communities. So, Linda Freed is the dean of the Mailman School at Columbia, which is actually where I got my graduate degree, but not in public health. And I think this quote from her is really perfect. The dirty little secret, anything you design that will facilitate access, engagement, safety, enjoyment, and participation by older people turns out to be good for all age groups. So I invite you to look at it through that lens, because I can tell you for sure, all of us are getting a little bit older every day. But if we don't start today to plan, we're going to lose the opportunity that's here at this moment. And with that, I want to say thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions. I've stunned you all into silence. Yes.
The 30 years, since 30-year increase in the longevity of people, since when?
In 1900, people lived to be about 47, and today, you can expect to live into your late 70s. And if you're in good health at 65, you can look into your 80s.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I agree with you. I think the potential benefits of travel training are huge. And I think in part that's indicated by the finding that your survey found that about 20% of people said they would be more inclined to travel if they had public transit. But I know from other work has shown that for people who actually have access to transit, a very small percentage of people 65 and over actually use it, with some rates as low as like 2%. So in that vein, I'm curious, were you able to follow up with people in your program who had undergone travel training to determine at some point in time, whether they were in fact increasing or using public transit.
Sure.
And how often.
Sure. So I'm going to answer that through two lenses. One is the Tip Smart program that I talked about specifically in this presentation. We did contact people 6 to 12 weeks after they'd been on that field trip, and 53% of them said that they had made another trip on transit. Now, I have to, in full disclosure, some of the people we trained had been on transit before. They weren't complete virgins. But we had one trip, and I think it was actually one of the images of a bunch of smiling people on a train. That was a group from Patterson who had been on the bus, but none of them had ever been on the train that was 2 blocks away from where they lived. So, yes, in that front. And then the other part of NJTIP, the program I direct, has a historical relationship with the ADA paratransit program that is operated by New Jersey Transit. 25% of the people that we serve on that program are over age 50, and we follow up with our graduates for 2 years, and we find that 87% of our graduates report at least using transit at least once after that training, and at our regular intervals of 1, 3, 6, 9, 12, and 24 months, in the aggregate, about 70% of respondents say that they're using when we check in with them. 40% of the people that graduate from our program, all ages, because we don't cut it, I don't have a cut that way. 40% of the people who graduate we call super users because they are using at every interval when we contact them. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
Thank you so much. Such an interesting presentation. I work in Rhode Island, and I'm a part of the age-friendly initiatives, and transportation just constantly comes up in any of the work groups as a major issue. And so I'm really interested in that training you were just kind of talking about. Could you give a little bit more information about kind of like recruitment and how you got people involved in that kind of a training and how long it was? And then my last little piece, if you have time to touch on, is I'm wondering about the use of like younger people, almost as like mentors potentially for transportation type options. I'm just thinking that they're oftentimes using it so much, and then my passionate intergenerational relationships. I'm just wondering if that's maybe a possibility of a good avenue for that.
Okay, so I'm going to try to answer you really quickly because I realize we're over time and I'm probably holding you from coffee. So by way of background, before I took this position, I actually developed age-friendly programs in northern New Jersey in conjunction with the Jewish Federation in northern New Jersey with NORC funding, with federal funding. And when I was doing that, I brought NJTIP in to do training with my seniors because I'd come from the world of accessible transportation. So before I ran the program, I was bringing them in because I saw the opportunity of showing seniors how to use the bus as part of an age-friendly strategy, particularly in small cities where there was a major corridor and there was a bus line, right? So that, fast forward, I ended up on the board of NJTIP, and then I ended up its director when it moved to Rutgers 5 years ago. And when we put together Tip Smart, we were using those historical experiences, and basically the model is a classroom session that's about 90 minutes, where we teach people about how to read a schedule and how New Jersey Transit works. Sometimes we'll bring a bus demo in and actually bring a New Jersey Transit bus, and they can get on it, ride the lift, ask questions. And then we come back about a week or two later, usually the same day and time of the week, and we take a trip on transit to a destination that the older adults have usually helped identify as interesting. We don't give them free rein, but we'll say these 3 or 4 places are convenient from here, and then we do the trip with them. And so that's sort of the model. In Bergen and Passaic County, we developed customized booklets called Your Guide to Transportation, specifically for older adults who lived in that county. They gave them all of the different options, including the municipal dial-a-ride programs in their community. And we use that as a training tool. And that was developed with the grant funding that we got from the Taub Foundation. Was there something else?
Oh, the intergenerational piece. Oh, thank you.
You know, we've done a little bit of intergenerational with field trips, seniors with seniors, like high school seniors with, you know.
Cool, yeah.
Yeah, and the very first travel training program that I did was under a Project Action grant about 25 years ago with 5th graders and seniors in Madison, Wisconsin. So I agree with you. We're still figuring out how to do it in New Jersey, but we're getting there. Yes.
I just wanted to point out, about 4 or 5 years ago, we were involved in a project with Westat, John Burkhart.
Oh, sure, we were too.
Yes, well, you were part of our project. actually.
Okay.
So we were trying to figure out best practices for developing travel training programs. And so we interviewed several different around the country, including yours. And that project resulted in a guidebook and basically best practices on how to develop travel training programs for older adults. So that's a resource that's available.
Absolutely. I think you guys were doing that about 20 minutes after I got my job. Because it was like one of the first things in my computer files was like Westat.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, thank you very, very much.